How's it going, AP World Historians? It is your teacher, Ben Osborne here, taking a look a little bit at Dar al Islam, which my understanding translates as House of Islam, and essentially means like sort of the world of Islam. In particular, this time period we're talking about, around 1200 or so, when we're talking about the gigantic influence of the cultural ideas of Islam in the world. So let's talk real quick about how we get to this point of the Dar al Islam in around 1200, and then we'll jump right in and talk a little bit about some of the changes and things that are going on in Islam around that time period. So, hopefully you know, but if you do not, Islam is founded by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. You will often see that listed behind his name as an honorific of sorts. Muhammad was a prophet of God, according to the Muslims. He ended up having a series of visions after the angel Gabriel came to him in a cave just outside of Mecca. And in that situation, then, he ends up receiving a lot of information from God. He receives these sort of revelations and ends up forming and founding the religion of Islam. In the process of doing that, then, he will move his religion down into Mecca. He'll gain some followers. He then will be forced out of Mecca and forced to the city of Medina, which at the time was called Yathrib, and Medina sort of means like the prophet's city. In the process of being moved up to that area, then we will have the foundation of sort of Islam as we know it. So the Islamic calendar is dated from this flight from Mecca to Medina. Eventually, he will end up having a change. He will end up basically running Medina. He'll have a lot of power and influence over Medina. He'll return to Mecca. He will take control of Mecca as well, and then he will expand his influence throughout the modern-day Saudi Arabian peninsula. Now, the thing about it, though, is that he does not have any sons to succeed him, and he also doesn't really leave any details on what to do when he dies. Who's supposed to take over the nature of Islam, or the running of Islam. And so when he dies, then there becomes a bit of a disagreement. Some people feel that it should be somebody who is just a good Muslim, somebody who is a good member of the Ummah or the body of Muslim faithful. Other people say, no, it needs to be blood related to the Prophet, because while he didn't have sons, he does have a number of nephews and other people who are related to his tribe and his clan. And so these two different groups of people are going to disagree with each other so much that they end up forming essentially two different divisions of the Muslim world. And so the group who felt it could be anybody as the successor is going to be the Sunni, and the people who feel that it needs to be blood related will be the modern day Shia. I should mention also that the name of the person who is the successor to Muhammad is, and I've heard it both ways, Caliph or Caliph. Basically, it means successor to the Prophet. So they are not prophets themselves. They are successors to Muhammad. So those individuals then will split, and they'll have some disagreements. So we'll initially have these four righteous caliphs, the first of which is Abu Bakr, who is not related to the Prophet. He was just a good companion of the Prophet. But eventually the fourth caliph, Ali, will be somebody who was descended from Muhammad, and as a result of being descended from Muhammad, he will be acceptable to the Shia. But ultimately, he is killed, assassinated, and so this one family will take over, who we're going to talk about right now. Okay, so let's take a look here. Again, this is Dar al Islam Unit 1. This is still in time period 1. So when we're taking a look here at the Abbasid dynasty, is going to replace the Umayyad dynasty. But the Umayyad dynasty is not something we've talked about quite yet. So let's talk about it. So when Ali is killed, this family will come in who is related to one of the earlier caliphs, and this family will end up taking control of the political dynasty, basically. Like, this wasn't supposed to be a political dynasty. Even if you were related to the Prophet, it wasn't supposed to go father to son. But the Umayyads, while they kind of keep the idea that it could be anybody that's related to the Prophet, they really keep the political power to themselves. So the Umayyad then will rise. They will be particularly powerful over time. And they will dominate this era. And one of the problems that they face, though, is this question over the kind of translation of Islam from a very regional, very ethnic religion into a more universalizing religion. So what happens if you are an Arab elite and you conquer an area that's filled with Jewish people and Christians? What do you do then? And what happens if one of those people wants to convert to Islam? Is that Is that all of a sudden something that's okay? Like, don't they have to still pay the tax? Like, what's going to happen? And so for the Umayyad then, Islam kind of remained more of an Arab kind of like religion. And so people who converted still had to pay the taxes. Like, it didn't matter what your conversion was or whatever, you still had to pay those taxes. And my understanding is that word that they used was mawali. In the process of becoming mawali then, these folks got really mad about it. And so they end up siding with another family called the Abbasid. And so this Abbasid family then is the one who will overthrow the Umayyad, partly as a result of their support of these converted Muslims instead. So once the Abbasid dynasty takes over the Umayyad, the Abbasid dynasty will lead to a golden age of the dynasties here for Islam. So we're going to see lots of new trade, lots of intellectual ideas, all this kind of stuff. Baghdad, at the time period that we're talking about, is one of the greatest cities around the world. It is the best city. It's the biggest. It's got all this amazing art and all these other kind of things that you just don't see in other places because they are so powerful. But over time then, like a lot of things, they will start to fall apart a little bit. So they are going to face these rapid problems. Big problem for them is that the whole empire is just way too big. It is huge. And they keep kind of like having parts of it carved off over time. Also, a lot of the Abbasids, much like their Umayyad predecessors, had moved to cities, like big cities, and so they had started enjoying the sumptuous life of food and golden things and stuff like this, which undermined a little bit of their authority. So one example of one of their problems is a group of people called the Mamluks. So these are slaves. Mamluks are military slaves, which is weird to us, I think, but we see this sometimes in Islam, and you see it in some other cultures as well. They are essentially owned by other people, but they fight in military situations. Now, you can probably figure out what happens if they're slaves and they have military weapons. They overthrow their owners. So the Mamluks actually are former slaves who built an empire in Egypt on cotton and the sugar trade. That Mamluk empire, however, will decline in power because of European sea trade, as well as some other issues as well. Another group of people that's going to come in here are called the Seljuk Turks. Now, Turks are nomadic peoples. They are Turkic peoples who used to live sort of in like northern Asia, kind of north of China, but they migrated out of that area into the western areas. And in the process, then, they convert to Islam, and they will end up basically much like the Romans, who invite in these barbarians to fight for them. The Abbasids are going to do something very, very similar. They're going to invite in these Seljuk Turks, and these Seljuks are going to take over. We have another group also called the Buyids, who will do something quite similar. The Buyids are also going to be in control of the Abbasids as well. So we end up having this sort of like political situation where the Abbasids are barely even in control of anything. This is the time period where we have the Crusades that are going to take place. There's lots of kind of weird out there information about the Crusades. There's something like 9 of them. Again, historians debate a lot on what qualifies as a crusade or not. The first 4 are really the most important ones. So the first one is going to end up taking over control of parts of the Holy Land. It was called by the Pope because they had the Muslims had seized control of various areas. They're able to create some small, what are called Crusader states in that region, but eventually those Crusader states are conquered later on as well. So the second crusade will be basically revolving around trying to recapture this county of Edessa that had fallen. Then we have the third one, and then finally the fourth one, which is a total disaster. The fourth one, these Frankish Western European knights are trying to get to Jerusalem to retake it, but in the process they get like swindled by the Venetians to the point where the Venetians are like, you owe us a bunch of money, why don't you do some stuff for us? And so to help pay off their bills, they go in and attack like other Christians who are enemies of the Venetians, to the point that they actually sack and take Constantinople and destroy the Byzantine Empire for a while until it sort of reconstitutes itself, but it never really comes back again. But these Western invaders of the Holy Land then are going to present a big challenge for the groups there. We're going to end up having a lot of people jockeying for position, so we end up having, for example, we're going to end up having Saladin. I was going to say Suleiman, but that's not right. Saladin, who is going to be an important guy. He's a Kurd who rules over Egypt at the time, and he is going to be able to defeat a lot of these Western invaders and things like the Horns of Hattin and other groups and other fights like that. Eventually, we're going to see the Mongols will invade, and we'll get to the Mongols later, but they are going to end the Seljuk and the Abbasid politically for good. Like, they will basically be destroyed. Into that period, then, we're going to have a group of people known as the Ottoman Turks, who are just simply a different tribe of Turks. Let's take a look at this vast change. Oh my gosh, look at this, okay? So over there, over there, you're going to see the map that has the Abbasid Caliphate around 800. So you can see it's huge, right? We're already seeing a little bit of breaking off there from the other end of the world, but most of that area is still going to be under their control. And they stretch all the way basically from India into North Africa. They control Sicily and some other parts like that as well. Now, fast forward 100, 200 years, and you can see just how bad things have gotten. So that Umayyad Caliphate, the Umayyads actually survive and are able to set up this area of Spain. But we also have all kinds of other folks like the Aghlahids, the Tulanids, the Buyids, Samanids. I mean, all kinds of crazy like little splinter groups there over time are going to end up taking control and splitting into these regional dynasties. They will give like lip service to the fact of a caliph, but they ain't doing anything about it. Trust me. So that division then is going to end up causing them a lot of problems and doing things like repelling the Mongols or repelling the Western invaders and others over time. All right. Let's continue on here just a little bit. So economically, the Abbasid are going to suffer when trade starts to go north of Baghdad to Constantinople. So Constantinople is that city that is going to be founded by Constantine, but eventually will become the capital of what we call the Byzantine Empire. They would just call themselves Rome. But when trade started to go north of Baghdad, because Constantinople's important trade, the Abbasids have a really hard time dealing with keeping their city up. So Baghdad is the central location where lots of trade came in, but when people start realizing they can go along the Silk Road to the north, then it's going to end up cutting down on a lot of their power. Within the Islamic world, slavery was not common, but it was practiced. So male slaves were often used for like mining. They might be used as assistants for certain reasons to do things. Female slaves were oftentimes allowed to dance for men. So like they were entertainers basically. And some of them could even make enough money to buy their freedom. A lot of female slaves were also concubines, like they were brought over for harems and things like that as well. So not common, but something that we do see. And the slave trade would be a big factor there for their economics. In Spain, the Umayyad will continue, as I mentioned before, but we're going to end up having a march or a battle called the Battle of Tours. Okay, so the Battle of Tours is a really important historical event. This is going to be Charles Martel. Charles the Hammer is going to end up fighting against a gigantic Muslim force in France near the city of Tours. And when they do so, then they will defeat that group and force the Muslims back across the Pyrenees into Spain. And that means that Western Europe, which could have been occupied by Muslim leaders for a long time, is not. And so that allows for things like Catholicism and Christianity to expand over time. Now, Spain, however, will continue to be Muslim for a good 700-something years. It's probably was Muslim longer than it has been in our modern times, I guess you would say. The Umayyad encouraged trade, however, made it very easy, and they're going to welcome a lot of traders from around the world. So pretty great situation for them there. So here you can see the Caliphate of Cordoba. A lot of the names here that we see today are going to be sort of based upon Muslim names and things. So, for example, one of the major cities down there you can see is Algeciras. That's the name of it in Spanish. It was originally Al Yazirat, and so they just sort of modified it over time. You can see Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, was Al Lisbona. And we also have other examples of that as well. So predominantly it's going to be Muslim. That changes then when we have the Reconquista in the 14th, 15th centuries, when we have Columbus comes in right after this time period, where these Christian kingdoms in the north will essentially force all these groups of people they called Moors south and take over control of that territory. Just an interesting little story for you. This Kingdom of Navarre up here is an important one for a lot of this. And for Reconquista, it's also going to form part of the basis of the future royal house of Spain. But one of my favorite stories is that one of the kings of Navarre was named Charles the Bad, which is not a good title. But he was a pretty important king, actually did a lot of stuff. So he was bad, I think, because his people didn't like him. But he has a great story about his accidental death. Apparently, people at the time thought alcohol was very, like like alcohol, not like wine or beer, but like alcohol was very much a medicine. And so they took a bunch of sheets and they doused those sheets in like very high grade alcohol and wrapped him in it, thinking that that would perhaps help his ailing problems as he got older. And then somebody tipped a candle on him. And so he went up in flames and died that way. And a lot of people really saw that as almost like a divine justice for him being the bad and for all the other things that he was doing. So just a little anecdote there. All right, let's check out the cultural and social life then. So one of the things that's unusual in the Dar al Islam in this period is that we're shifting away from the Arab and Persian roots to more Turkic ones. So what we're seeing then is that initially Islam is going to be an Arabic religion. They will initially conquer the Persians. It's one of the first groups that they conquer. And so they will also bring in some of these Persian ideas as well. However, that will shift from those things, which are still very important. Arab and Persian roots are still going to be important in this period. But we're going to start to see other groups like the Seljuks, the Ottomans, the Mughal, other groups like that are going to end up becoming much more powerful groups. And so their languages, their ideas, their concepts are going to become incredibly important to the Muslim world as well. I think oftentimes in the West, when we think of Islam, we think of it as being sort of monolithic, like it's Arabic, it's whatever. But in reality, there's an enormous amount of ethnic difference and disagreement between different groups of Muslim peoples out there. So lots of different, they're all part of one culture because of Islam and trade, but it's going to be minimized a bit, or it's going to be expanded a bit, because of these different groups. Many intellectual concepts were also developed in this time. So, for example, Greek classics. A lot of the Western world had gotten rid of these Greek classics, thinking they were evil, but the Muslims were going to hold on to them. So math texts, algebra is from the Arabic word algebra. I don't know what that means, but the al is a thing that means sort of for Arabic languages. Math texts, paper making, medical advances, astronomy, etc. A lot of these things are things that are going to come over to the West after they learn a lot more about it. Really cool guy named Ibn Khaldun. He was a famous geographer and historian who studied around the world. We're also going to have some what's called Sufi mysticism. Is going to contribute to new poetry and new converts. So Sufis were an unusual division. They were a part of the Shia division, but they're not necessarily kind of like outskirts of that tradition. Traditionally in Islam, the idea that you would see the face of God would be something that you do when you die. The only person who really ever saw God during their lifetime was Muhammad. But Sufis felt that that was still a possibility, that you may be able to essentially commune with God or see the face of God during your lifetime if you just simply did certain things. So they were mystics. They believed in dances, ecstatic dances and things like that in order to make them have these visions and things as a part of that. And so they do a lot of poetry, but they also believe missionary work was a huge factor for them as well. Trade was encouraged socially. They really thought trading was good. I mean, Muhammad had been a merchant, right? So trading is really good. So they're going to end up having a very, very effective trade network and trade systems. I really like this quote by Ibn Khaldun. Blindly following ancient customs and traditions does not mean that the dead are alive, but that the living are dead. I think in the West, we oftentimes think of Islam as being maybe sort of a very conservative religion, that things don't change over time. But we have this period where there's so much going on. Islam in this time period in particular was far more what we might call progressive today than we would see in other parts of the world. So in this case, the idea of following customs and traditions, it's important, but you shouldn't necessarily do it, is what Ibn Khaldun is telling us here. So just kind of fascinating kind of perspective on Islam. All right. Finishing up here with cultural and social life. Okay, going back to slaves, and not in an economic factor, but sort of in a social factor. Slaves were a fact of life. One of the things about slavery there is that it's not hereditary in most cases, and it's also not ethnic either. They are treated pretty well, again, for slaves. I do not want to underemphasize this, that slavery, of course, is terrible. It's awful. People should not be slaves, obviously. Slavery in Islam, though, was not always, it was not racial like it is in the slavery of the Americas and other places. There were a lot of black slaves, what we would call black slaves or African slaves. They were called Zanj by the Muslim groups, but other people also could potentially be slaves. So, for for example, one of the military forces that we talk about, the Janissaries, they were actually kidnapped Christian boys from the Balkan Mountains. So you're going to see that slavery is a lot of different things there. One thing that's interesting is that conversion to Islam could lead to freedom because you were not allowed to have Muslim slaves. So if you converted to Islam, you could get your independence. Status of women was generally better under Islam in this period. Women were asked to cover their heads, but I mean, if you went to Constantinople in this period, it's the exact same. Like women wore veils and things. It wasn't uncommon. Women in the Islamic world could also study in school. Islam forbade a tradition in pre-Islamic Arabic world, which was infanticide of girls. In the harsh environment of the deserts prior to Islam, there was a practice of just killing off girls because they didn't feel like they were very useful, because they were not as strong as men, I guess, and they also had the custom was that they had to pay dowries and things. So that was a common practice. So Islam forbade that, said, nope, can't do that anymore. And it also altered the dowry rules a little bit so that it made it so that culturally it was not something that women would be looked down upon in society. So just some interesting changes there. In Spain, we also see a huge focus on learning. So in Spain, the region had one of the largest libraries in the world, for example. People of the book, which are people who are Christians or Jews, were generally treated pretty well. And Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars all influenced the work of others in this period. So we're seeing a lot of intellectual activity. We're seeing a lot of activity where Muslims are bringing in other groups of people together to kind of make things even better than things would be before. So hopefully that helped you out just a little bit to understand a little bit more about Dar al Islam, the House of Islam. It is a fascinating topic, and we'll find out more what's going on here when we figure it out for the next section for our next time period as well. Hope this was beneficial to you. Again, as always, I am your teacher, Ben Osborne. I hope you all are doing well, and take care.